You have a greater than chance probability your child will just self-identify with their biological sex and thus not experience a 50-50 suicide rate. It seems like the math is fairly obvious. You transition.
It absolutely is. That rate drops dramatically when like you stop lying. That's it.
Your kid, you are boosting their suicide rate to 47%.
That's so you to say that. That is so incredibly to do an inverse and then to blame it when you are the problem. I have no idea what to expect. I mean, if I were to hazard a guess, I'm going to assume that Tim Pool does not like Neo-pronouns. I mean, I am kind of basing that on the title of this too. Neo-pronouns and their consequences have been disastrous for the human race. Disastrous for the human race.
Pronouns and stuff and all these things is, for one, there's no logical consistency to teach. You end up with these viral videos of this young woman on TikTok with, hundreds of thousands of views saying frog and frog self. And it seems to just be
this already.
and the people on the left will argue that, well, it's people exploring their self-expression. And it's just like, well, there's no logic. There's a flag for everything.
So what I've found is that Libs of TikTok and other hate organizations like Gays Against Groomers, which of course Tim Pool has been featured on before, they like to take cases where they'll find someone making a video on a topic and then they try to extrapolate that as being something that every single person is advocating for if they happen to be LGBTQ+. So it can be like one person making one video where that one person is saying one thing, and then it's like, so broadly speaking, you're all saying that you can no longer call women women, that we have to call them bonus hole carriers, and that's I mean, that's just gone too far for me, all
you're basically telling kids is nothing. You're telling them chaos, static, noise, no definitive understanding of what's going on. Perhaps an adult.
Neo-pronouns, a thing barely anyone knows, uses, or affects anyone materially. That's the reality of the subject, even though the discussion around neo-pronouns, like, this is pretty extreme, I would say. Disastrous for the human race.
Could understand enough about reality to explore various ideas around how do you categorize. But to go to a child and say an infinite number of categories, every day they're learning something that was just made up yesterday, they're going to have no framework for what's going on.
Well,
sorry, just
please, no.
To address the...
So my experience with neo-pronouns is when it comes to people who use or want you to use neo-pronouns, they will let you know what pronouns they prefer. And if you don't want to be a dick, you use those pronouns. That's about the extent of it. And if you don't want to use neo-pronouns at all, because you are principled and you say it will destroy the very sanctity of the English language and that the limit to which new words can enter the vocabulary is capped, so nothing new. We're like, English is over. It's done. The language has stopped encompassing new terms. That's what you want. You can actually still do that and still not be a dick just by using the person's name. Right? You could use the person's name as you have with any other person. Just use their name, right? And that's as far as it has to go.
The harming themselves. With the laws being passed in California, Washington, and a bunch of these other states that protect third parties who would bring a child for gender reassignment or
and this has been, by the way, a big fear-mongering topic that's been done since, like, this is what made Jordan Peterson famous, if everyone forgets, right? Trying to lie about that bill in Canada, saying, like, the bill was going to, like, infringe upon speech, and that people were going to be forced to use terms like Z and Zer, and if they don't, they could risk either being imprisoned or being fired from their jobs at the very least, all this kind of stuff, which just didn't happen, when it was actually a bill to include gender within the protected classes of Canada, which is a good thing, by the way. Prior to that, people could be discriminated against directly for their genders, as in you could refuse someone rent housing them. You could be like, oh, I'm going to reject this application based on the fact that I have no idea what your pronouns mean, things like that. It adds protection, which is very essential for people not being fired or kicked out of their homes simply for existing.
Or medical intervention. We're now entering the territory where a 10-year-old kid who has no understanding of what's going on is told by an adult, and this has happened to personal friends of mine twice, and that seems like a heck of a lot for me. Two people that I know had their daughters come home with the teachers telling them that they were trans or lesbian, and they were not. They were
So, anecdotes. And these anecdotes are so fast and furious that they're real. Exciting.
10. And when
I mean, I don't believe any part of it, right? I think what most likely happened was that teachers were having a discussion about these topics, and they were like, by the way, just so everyone understands this, trans people exist, non-binary people exist. Non-binary people sometimes would like to and be preferred to be referred to by different pronouns, such as they, them, for example. That's pretty much it. But Tim is kind of like, spinning it as, and then they were forced. Yeah, they say they forced them. They said that you're trans now. You have no choice.
the parents explained to them, okay, let me ask you, you think you're this. Do you know what this means? And the kids go, what? No.
Cuba codified this into their constitution last year. A referendum was held in Cuba to approve amendments to the family code of the Cuban constitution. The referendum passed legalizing same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, and the altruistic surrogacy, amongst other rights, and greatly strengthened gender equality. Following the referendum, Cuba's family policies have been described as the most progressive in Latin America. I'd seen the same-sex thing when it happened, but I don't know what it does for gender. That one section. Let me scroll through.
Oh, no. Now, what happens if you're in California and the parents are more susceptible to whatever you say, honey? Next thing you know, these kids who have no idea what Lupron is or what it means to get puberty blockers is on a fast track for this, which has resulted in 50,000 people on Reddit joining the D-trans community and an endless slew of posts of people threatening suicide. What I see in the data, and so if you look at the desistance rates.
By the way, you just described people joining a subreddit. That's evidence of nothing. It's odd too because Tim refused to use Reddit as a source when I said the very author of the study that he was trying to pull up to talk about desistance rates actually has completely debunked everyone who uses her study and has come out to say, by the way, people are misrepresenting what the findings say in my own study. And that was published in an AMA on Reddit, and Tim was like, oh, fire Reddit, of course. I was like, okay, well then here's another source citing that this is the author of your study, right? I'm not citing Reddit as the source. I'm citing the author of the academic study that you're trying to use as evidence for desisting rates. That is calling into question how you're manipulating her own work.
What is it? The number I believe is 68 to 95% of children who identify as transgender will desist. That doesn't mean detransition. It means,
and that's not true. 100% false. It's completely debunked.
Means that if left to go through their natural puberty, they end up identifying with their biological sex. Typically, they end up being either autistic or gay. What happens now is they will just
You're pulling out Aaron Reed, a friend of the show. But anyways, one of the most common myths heard in anti-trans hearings is that most trans kids will desist if they're allowed to go through puberty. Sometimes specific numbers are given, such as 80% of trans kids desist. This statistic has been cited as low as 60% and as high as 99% in various literatures. Montana representative used the statistic to justify passing a medical ban. The Heritage Foundation has also pushed this myth. Nearly every hearing on the topic includes this myth. The desist myth is one of the most persistent falsehoods that has been used against the trans community for decades. It is misleading and inaccurate, and it comes from an outdated DSM-4 criteria and decades-old data. Newer studies show that 97.5% of transgender youth are persistent in their gender identities. Let's examine how this falsehood originated and how it is misused and what the current research reveals about the rare desistance and detransition. I'll share this link, by the way, but if you go into this in more detail, and also this is one of the reasons why the actual authors of the Swedish study, for example, have come forward to speak about how the information is being mishandled. It's based on classification criteria and how classification criteria was used in the previous manual. And so know that there is not a current, as our understanding is, desistance rate of 80%. And amongst adults, when you look at meta-studies, which again combine studies that have happened globally, academic peer-reviewed studies, by the way, you will find out that within that meta-study, the desistance rate is less than 1%. So to continuously present this at this point is both disingenuous, it's unscientific, it's unacademic, and it's just repeating, at this point, completely debunked statistics over and over and over. If you keep saying it, someone can cite someone else who can cite someone else. It's like, well, I heard about this on the Joe Rogan podcast. Well, yeah, he got it from that Libs a TikTok account. The DSM-4, released in 1994, spelled out how to diagnose mental health conditions, including gender identity disorder, which is no longer considered a disorder. In this manual, clinicians made their first attempt to diagnose trans youth. The first diagnostic criteria was an admirable early attempt, but contained a fatal flaw in how trans youth were diagnosed. To diagnose bafflingly did not require a youth to identify as another gender. Instead, it focused on factors such as preference for cross-sex games and activities and preference for friends of the other sex. Problems with this diagnostic criteria could be immediately recognizable world today, a cisgender tomboy with absolutely no identification as a boy would be diagnosed with gender identity disorder under these definitions. A cisgender boy who would like to put on the Elsa costume and play with girls could be diagnosed with gender identity disorder under these definitions. So it's the opposite of what Tim Pool is saying. It's actually a very good thing that we don't do the very thing that he's accusing the current understanding of the trans issue of doing, right? He's saying, and even Bill Maher has repeated this, by the way, he's saying that hey, this is really scary because what if it turns out that your kid is gay, and then what, you're undergoing all of these really aggressive procedures, such as taking Lupron or something like that, and you just had a gay kid all along. That's a scary thing. Well, yeah, it's a really good thing that we've come from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5 to be able to now understand that yes, that would be a false diagnosis of someone who is trans. In 2013, the DSM-5 was published. In it, many corrections were made on how gender dysphoria or dysphoric youth are diagnosed. The most important correction was the requirement that a trans youth demonstrate an insistent, persistent, and consistent desire or identification as the gender that the patient believes they are. And then here's the biggest differences between the DSM-4, which was from 94 to 2013, and the current DSM-5, 2013 to current.
Whatever it is the kid is saying, despite the fact that the majority of these kids would self-identify.
Oh, thank you. So this is Cuba, by the way. There is a transition from a system of authority to a system of responsibility in the relationship between mothers and fathers towards their children, which, far from being weakened, enhances and reinforces the powers of legal representation and administration of the child's assets, the rights, and the duty to have them, take care of them, offer them love, emotional stability, educate them without violence, respect their own characteristics, taking into account their growth and gradual development. Based, Cuba. Well done.
If they're allowed to go through puberty. My concern here is you bring in young kids who don't understand what they're hearing. You layer on books and ideas and things that are more confusing to a child than anything. You layer on the social factor of Instagram, likes, views, etc. And you end up with all of these stories of these prominent, now famous detransitioners saying, I didn't understand. More horrifyingly, you end up with these stories on Detrans Reddit, where we read one last night where a 17-year-old was threatening.
So you layer in all these imaginary things that I'm worried about, and then once you've done that, you create an imaginary scenario that I'm going to propagate right now, something very scary, and then we get famous transitioners. I've had a couple on my show, like Ollie London, for example. Definitely not people who see a potential vehicle for becoming rich and or famous through the very right-wing apparatus that exists today. Yeah, definitely on Ollie London, for example, he is 100% one of these cases where someone was, manipulated by all of the trans agenda and trans ideology.
Suicide because she felt manipulated into getting a double mastectomy, testosterone, and it ruined her life. And now she feels like she can't lead a normal life.
Well, yeah.
You have these laws being passed that would protect a
And by the way, that's why it is a very good thing that we have a much better understanding of all of this, that people are not getting or would be getting frequently misdiagnosed, for example, along the way. Because yes, even amongst, various advocates and communities that are trying to fight for trans liberation and stuff like that, they have come and been fully vocal about, yes, detransitioners are valid. Of course they are. And they don't want people to be wrongly diagnosed. So they would rather there be more mechanisms in place for people to recognize whether or not they are trans. The social media aspect, that's what they see as a contagion. Right? Like you'll see, like when Joe Rogan and a lot of these people were talking about this before Elon Musk really put the idea of the woke mind virus in everyone's head, they were always talking about how there seems to be a contagion, this kind of a, social contagion is what they called it. And that we're just seeing like more and more people than ever identifying as LGBTQ plus, right? It's like, well, access to information can make a lot more people who might not even understand what these concepts are suddenly be aware that we have language to describe it, such as what is a non-binary person? What is an asexual person? Well, now we have a lot of language to be able to describe these things, and people have more access to learning about that. Also, if there is better conditions, if people feel safer, if they don't feel scared, they're going to be a lot more ready to come out and explain, hey, by the way, I identify as such.
Third party. A third party can take someone's child to the state, dramatically alter their life, cause irreversible changes and or harm, and be legally protected because these kids are not equipped to understand what they're signing up for. My last point on this is, if desistance rates truly are between 60 and 95%, and suicide rates are around 40 to 50%,
oh, you
the
ghoul.
Smartest and most logical thing we can
Absolute
do,
ghoul.
considering the majority of these.
It's because of you. It's because of fucking segments like this. That's why those rates are high. It's because of fucking social stigma. Every time there's an academic study on this, it points towards the same thing. Social stigma. Like, it would take but one case, one fucking study to come forward to be like, hey, by the way, we've discovered that once you correct for this, once you do not bully, once you reduce the amount of social stigma amongst trans youth, it turns out that they have comparable rates of mental health or superior, like even better results than their cis peers. Well, that's amazing. Maybe we should stop all being assholes. I mean, society-wide.
Kids will identify with their biological sex, not be trans, and thus experience lower rates of suicide is not to intervene at all in any medical way for a child who's experiencing gender dysphoria.
It's the opposite, though. Yeah, I mean, all the data we have points towards the exact opposite of that. That, again, it's social stigma is the cause, and if they have better access both to healthcare as well as less social stigma in society, yes, their mental health improves dramatically.
Until after puberty. If we're looking at it from a simple probability,
and that's basically one of the things I knew about this. Neo-pronouns, once again, is an entry point for bigots to try and go after restrictive policies on trans people, right? Like, if people are saying, hey, by the way, adults, broadly speaking, that they don't have as much of a problem as the pundit class do, or as the far right or the Christian nationalists do, with trans people existing. A lot of adults, even conservative adults, sometimes will say, well, I don't care what decisions an adult makes for themselves. If they want to do that, that's fine. Well, yeah, and then you'll have cases like this with a Tim Pool who'll just readily start pushing all of this bile, unscientific fucking quackery, you know, skull measuring shit, where he'll talk about how, well, okay, so if we take the statistic, that is false, by the way, the 80% desist statistic, false, and then we combine that with the real world statistic that is an absolute tragedy of how often, you know, trans youth experience suicidal ideation. If we combine the two of them, then presto facto, we have ourselves a situation that I'm going to manipulate for profit. Right? Neo-pronouns are a way to have that conversation because, oh yeah, normies most likely are going to find this silly, right? Hey, you find like frog gender silly, don't you? Doesn't everyone? The idea that your gender could be a frog. So like, since you think that's silly and you're here, can I talk to you about Lupron? Because you got a seat at the table now, so let's bring up that Lupron, eh?
Let's just say it's the lowest number, 60%. Okay.
Oh yeah, I know. We barely spoken about Neo-pronouns. They mentioned it for the first, like, I think like 40 seconds of this video, and then we're just right into back to line about the trans issue.
You have a greater than chance probability your child will just self-identify with their biological sex and thus not experience a 50-50 suicide rate. It seems like the math is fairly obvious. You transition.
It absolutely is. That rate drops dramatically when assholes like you stop lying. That's it.
Your kid, you are boosting their suicide rate to 47%.
That's fucked. That's so fucked for you to say that. That is so incredibly fucked to do an inverse and then to blame it when you are the problem. You are the problem. Every single person who refuses to learn about this, who refuses to actually look at the science on this topic, which, by the way, is decided. There's no debates amongst the medical community about this. Every major medical association in America agrees on this topic, and you come to it this way where you're like, hey, there's a very high rate of suicide amongst trans youth. And it's like, okay, that is true. Yep. So maybe the problem is the fact that people are trying to push them into being trans. Nope. No, the studies on this conclusively point towards social stigma being the problem. The problem is you. The problem is the Tim Pools of the world lying about this shit. And when you're talking about fucking youth suicide, I could not imagine a more ghoulish angle to try and come at this from while profiting off all of this at the same time. Like, that's disgusting.
Well, and I was going to say, I mean, for my part, I mean, I have two friends who they had CPS called on them. If you didn't seem like you were immediately celebrating, affirming, yeah, CPS was called on them. And then this is what I'm noticing, just overall, is that
hey Jeff, good to see you.
The California legislature and other places, in my opinion, are chipping away at parental responsibilities. Traditional parental responsibilities, and this area is one. But I mean, in the midst of this, we do have a growing number little by little here of young people who are detransitioning. But the thing I'm concerned about is that there is this messaging of celebrate, celebrate, celebrate towards those who are making these decisions. But the detransitioners are often humiliated, silenced, and shamed. And to me, that is indicative of part, and I don't think everybody.
They're not, though. They're not. Again, overwhelmingly, I've seen nothing but the repeated statement, especially amongst like, you know, LGBTQ plus activists and groups and communities, that detransitioners are of course valid. It's the other side that is utilizing, and by the way, you are the ones giving them an incredible amount of a megaphone, right? They go on the shows, the circuits, they get to talk about this. They are the center focus whenever this discussion happens, both in right wing and on liberal media. Liberal media is the same way in this. Like when you get articles in the New York Post, in the BBC, in all of these outlets that basically talk about, or the Atlantic, for example, hey, we have to talk about this very serious issue. It seems to be a centerpiece of the culture war right now. We're going to interview 3 detransitioners and then 1 trans person. And then, you know, we're going to be fair and balanced and allow the truth to come out at the very end. But it's like, but you are overrepresenting a less than 1%. This is a less than 1% of people, according to the meta studies, who end up regretting this. Their problems and their story is completely valid, but you are only giving them a megaphone. What happens to the other 99% of people who this can be life-saving to?
Believes that. I think there's a lot of people that don't, but I think the way in which I have seen detransitioners treated, it's so sad.
See, I don't actually agree with this. However, I do 100% understand where you're coming from, and I see that logic, and I understand your mathematical model, and that statistically, I understand your point of view, and I get that. However, I'm gonna make a comparison, and again, because I just love getting people to hate me. That's just like my job, right? It's like, do you remember, kind of like pre-2020, where like the classic news was Black individuals are targeted by the police and it never makes it on the news. And that was the news story. Like the news story itself was Black people are never on the news. That to me is the same situation where it's like the current news story is detransitioners are never on the news, which inherently puts them on the news, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I understand your perspective, but I've heard it so many times by the same groups of people. Like, well, we never pay attention to detransitioners because that amount is like infinitesimally small. And actually, we do hear about it all the freaking time. You just are, it's always in the context of, oh, we never hear about detransitioners. Yes, we do. It's literally on like, it's like on every YouTube channel and podcast. Right. I hear it consistently. And then like that other side note though, of that idea of like, well, it's always like celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. Just an idea, just an idea. That idea of, yes, parents, you guys, you know your kids and you know them extremely well, right? However, if you don't celebrate a kid's exploration into different topics, they sometimes start pushing back without even knowing what they're pushing back against. And that's actually what I'm more worried about. That idea of, and of course I can't speak on like specific clients, right? But like I can say I've had multiple instances where a parent has, come to me and being like, oh, well, she wants to be called he now. What do I do? And I gotta say, I say the exact opposite thing of kind of what you're going for, is I say like, go with it. Because when you start pushing against it, they start pushing back on the parent without even knowing what they're pushing back on. And I've had plenty of students, and this is nothing against the trans community, because I'm such like, obviously, right? But I've had plenty of students who, yeah, they are gender queer and whatever, and their pronouns say whatever. And I've also had plenty of students where they said, oh yeah, I'm definitely trans. And we were like, oh, cool. Okay. They, them, he, him, she, her, whatever. And you went with it for a couple months. And then they realized after just leaving it with just going with it, they're like, actually, that's not a thing.
This is why parents don't want it in schools.
But like, okay. But again, like, how big is the problem? It's just, I don't see it as a fundamental issue, right? I see, of course, any teacher going outside of their realm of expertise as an issue, right? I am a learning specialist with a Master's of Science in Education with a focus in language processing disorders. I'm not an endocrinologist. I can't say you should take this hormone. That's out of my scope. I can't say that. That's not allowed, or it shouldn't be, right? But also that idea of like, is it really that bad if like, oh, okay, you go by she, they, and then I call my student they, and everyone on TikTok, I can't believe you call students they, them, you're indoctrinating. No, like they literally asked me to call them they, them. Like, it's just, I don't know if this indoctrination thing is real. I do understand the statistical analysis that you gave, though. I'd love to hear more about that.
I'd say it is.
Okay.
With books like Genderqueer and This Book is Gay being in schools, and there's a substantially, it's more than just these two books we have in front of us. And then, of course, critical race theory was the big debate a couple of years ago, because it seems like critical theory in general was being brought into schools in a variety of ways. So,
No, it wasn't. That just turned out to be a big nothing burger that y'all turned into policy. I mean, if anything, bravo. Well done. It's impressive that you took something that doesn't even happen. Where it's like, oh, this course isn't even taught in schools. Nah, this is like an advanced law course. Yeah. Oh, well, but you think it is. Oh, and now everyone's really scared that it is. Whoa, grown-ass adults are ripping their shirts off in PTA meetings, screaming that they don't want CRTs taught in school. Wow, neat.
it is indoctrination.
Okay.
My response to most people is like, we want indoctrination. We just don't want that indoctrination. We want to teach the positive values of our moral frameworks, innocent until proven guilty, et cetera. Those are big components. The rights of the individual, meritocracy.
Then why are all of the people that you support always fucking banning books? Why are they banning books in fucking libraries in Florida right now? And those books happen to specifically be either about queer theory or African American history.
And now we have children being taught an inversion of this. And we have, in many circumstances, the severing of the family unit in terms of don't tell your parents.
Okay.
The response from liberals is they're trying to force schools to out the children to their parents. Well, you have no right. If a child is experiencing anything, be it bulimia or some kind of gender confusion, it is not the state.
I mean, we're not going to explore this topic in detail because I think it requires a lot more nuance than Tim will ever give it. But what you're talking about and you're bringing up is the example of, hey, if a parent is potentially abusive to a child, then at what point does either a school or the state have to intercede in that, right? If a parent is sexually abusing or physically abusing children. And I'm saying that's being applied in this case to someone who may be trying to prevent their child from, even living in the house, for example. Like kids get kicked out of their houses for being gay all the time. They get kicked out of their houses for being trans. There's a disproportionate amount. I think it's almost 50% of homeless youth is LGBTQ plus, right? There's a really, really big reason for that.
Obligation nor right to intervene in that regard. But that is what's happening.
Well, and I want to say something to that because for a couple things with regards to schools, I mean, we had a situation where a volunteer at a school had threatened our oldest when he was young. And I noticed some change in him after school. And I was never told about this. So I actually approached the school staff, and then that's when I learned of the situation. There was another situation with our youngest in school where there were threats from other students. And so one of the times I went to the school board meeting is our youngest had multiple threats from a student, really descriptive, graphic threats. And what happened was I had been getting those notices about, your child's been exposed to lice, your child's been exposed to strep throat, but I was never notified when our littlest had these very scary experiences at school.
Liability issues.
Yeah, it's very concerning.
But
and so,
nonetheless, a false equivalent. Like they're not the same thing, right? Like that idea of like, this is what I'm like constantly trying to get on, which is that idea of like, they're not the same thing. Like your child being threatened, you need to tell the parent. Your child is injured, you need to fill out an accident report. That actually is usually mandated, but it's like different if it's like, oh, so-and-so said they want to go by they, them. Would I tell the parent? 1,000%, right? But is it is it mandated? Like, is it, hear me out. Okay. And this is like very tricky. If a student ever comes to me and they're like, I go by they, them, but my mom doesn't know, or my dad doesn't know, my first thought is there's something that needs to be repaired within family communication. It's not, I gotta hide this kid's gender identity from the parent. It's the idea of we need to create some type of environment where this conversation needs to happen. Because if I immediately, and I'm not saying this is even the case, right? But if a teacher immediately, like you said, like outs a kid, right? That could create a problematic situation. In fact, it could be creating a situation where it's indoctrination to be straight and cisgendered, right? Which is actually much more indoctrinating. It's usually that way, right? Like on average, most Disney movies, despite like new recent developments, most Disney movies kind of perpetuate the kind of what we consider the fancy word is like heteronormative, right? Heteronormative cisgendered ideologies.
It's true.
And do we need to kind of perpetuate that as the norm? I love that idea of like, you know, we want to indoctrinate innocent until proven guilty. But does that translate to straight until proven gay? Like those are two very different things in my opinion.
Well, don't do any of it.
Yeah. And I
So,
think, sorry.
no, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, I think for my part, it is a fair comparison only in the sense of,
It's all bullshit. There's no such thing as being able to indoctrinate children into becoming like gay or trans. You're born gay and trans. And like, it's one of those things where gay and trans queer kids exist. They're going to go to school like everyone else. So yeah, they should have a safe environment just like everyone else does. I don't believe you need to go to the extremities or like the extremes of just removing the utility of the English language, getting rid of pronouns and the very discussion of gender altogether, because all of you are so confused. Because it's just a bunch of adults who are so confused over this, and they've been lied to by the Tim Pools who just keep telling them the same bullshit over and over and over again. Hey, by the way, your kids are being indoctrinated. They're turning their kids gay, blah, blah, blah. Like, you can't do that. It's one of the reasons why I asked them all. I was like, is there any amount of gay porn I could show all of you that would turn you gay? And then Seamus was like, I don't know, man. There's like people in prison, you know? I was like, if they're having sexual encounters with men more frequently than they would outside of prison, that's probably an access reason, right? Because the people in prison are overwhelmingly going to be, and almost exclusively, of the same gender as them. And so in that case, it's not that they're turning the prisoners gay, or the mere presence of a bunch of men showering together suddenly makes dudes gay or anything like that. It's pretty wild. But yeah, so like we suspected, none of this had anything to do with neopronouns. It was neopronounless outside of the very, very beginning and the discussion of it. And again, if you like, I know neopronouns are a thing that even like, you know, liberal allies seem to disagree with and say like, it can actually hurt the cause and all this kind of stuff. It's like anything else. If you do not want to use neopronouns, because the very concept of it really, really hurts you personally to try and, you know, use a different pronoun than you're accustomed to, you can use someone's name. Like you never have to be a dick. You don't have to use neopronouns, and you can still use someone's name to refer to that person. It's not the hardest thing in the world. And I agree, we can go gayer. Absolutely.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form. Available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
Thank you kindly to our Lord and Saviors Peyton L. Just and Xander Corvus. Without you, we are nothing. And now, a shout out to our Knights of the Square Table. Amazing Flesh, Anna Loves Riley, Adrian McCarthy, DM Rivera, Doug Cady, Everything Important, Hagbard Celine, Izzy Solidarity, La Media Panza, Matthew Scarborough, Multimondi, Nettle, Omni, Peanut Butter Blonde, Political Papi, Quiet 185, Rachel K, Riley and Anna, Roller Dragon, Kubi, Cernicus, Spinach Monster, Stellar Vision, Sebastian Dimmel, Thomas, Trevbot EXE, Lucidry, Words Greenwood, Cheryl Alvarez, Tony Perkins, Thomas, O'Pecker, Travis McClinton, and Victoria Bell. Thank you so much. And a huge shout out to all the other people who make this entire show possible. Without you, it would not exist. If you can support us, please go to patreon.com/theserfs, and even $1 can help unlock all of the little goodies and help make this show entirely possible.